Hello, I am back and I am going to read the very first part of chapter 4, King George. And this title is titled Early Reign. Early Reign. The early reign of King George the Fifth. So it's really good. It's very interesting. And I am going to show you a picture of King George so you can look at him instead of my face. There he is. Okay. King George reign coincided with national and international upheaval, war, and revolution, which reshaped empires, creating a new and contemporary style of royal court. He smoothed the process of political change. In an epoch when many of the older European monarchies were being abolished, this was an achievement of great substance. So, yeah, and this is important to know because during his reign, the Russian monarchy had ended, and some other monarchies had ended. So, the German monarchy, Kaiser Wilhelm, his cousin. Anyways, I will get started because it is a long chapter and I want to read it in 3 parts. It's the end of an era, a hat, stick, and gloves, poison pens, Escher and Mensdorf, royal residence, crowned and anointed. These are the subtitles of early reign. On the 6th of May, 1910, Prince of Wales entered upon his proud but dreaded heritage. He wrote in his diary, at 11:45, beloved Papa passed peacefully away, and I have lost my best friend and the best of fathers. I never had a word with him in my life. I am heartbroken and overwhelmed with grief. But God will give me my responsibilities, and darling May will be my comfort as she has always been. May God give me strength and guidance in the heavy task which has fallen upon me. King Edward's last days were mirrored by the restless energy of his life. He had returned to London from a holiday in Byards on the evening of Wednesday, on the 27th of April. Although troubled by bronchitis and tired by the Channel crossing, he was at Covent Gardens 2 hours later to hear Tetrazzini sing in the Rialto. The next morning, he resumed his daily program of state business and audiences, attended the private view of the Royal Academy, and dined out with Miss Agnes Kaiser, the founder of the London hospital which bears his name. Queen Alexandra was staying at Corfu with her brother, the King of Hellenes, and did not reach London until the day before her husband's death. King Edward was again at the Opera House on the Friday to hear Siegfried. He spent his weekend at Sandringham, stumping the estate in wind and rain to inspect improvements to his property. By the time he arrived back at Buckingham Palace on Monday afternoon, his heart had begun to fail and he could not breathe. Only with difficulty could he breathe. Throughout the last week, he nevertheless refused to cancel a single engagement. I shall not give in, he replied to a visitor who remonstrated with him. I shall work to the end. On the morning of Friday, the 6th of May, he struggled to smoke a cigar, insisting on donning a frock coat to receive his closest friend, Sir Ernest Cassel. Soon after midday, he collapsed but resisted attempts to put him to bed. As the flame flickered, he was able to take in the news that his horse, Witch of Air, had won 4.15 race, the 4:15 race at Kempton Park. When the Prince of Wales repeated the message, His father replied, "Yes, I have heard of it. I am very glad." They were the king's last coherent words. He died just before midnight. Early on the following morning, King George V, as he has now become, was told by his eldest son that the royal standard was flying at half-mast over Buckingham Palace, wherein the late king had laid dead. He at once gave orders that it was instead to float in full majesty over his own residence, the Marlborough House. Just such an incident had marked the accession of Edward VII 9 years earlier, when the new king noticed that the royal standard flying on the yacht which bore his mother's remains across the Solent from Osborne was displayed at half-mast. On being asked for an explanation, the captain of the yacht said, "Sir, the Queen is dead." And Edward VII replied, "But the King lives." After attending to the small but significant matter of the royal standard, King George V spent the first morning of his reign at a full meeting of the Privy Council, whose members he addressed with simple sincerity. 2 days later, he watched with ancient ceremony at which the Garter of King of Arms proclaimed his accession. Whereas it is pleased the Almighty God to call to His Majesty our late Sovereign Lord, King Edward VII of blessed and glorious memory, by whose decree the imperial crown of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland is solely and rightfully come to the high and mighty Prince George Frederick Ernest Albert. We therefore, the Lords spiritual and temporal of the realm, being here assisted with these of His late Majesty's Privy Council, with a number of other principal gentlemen of quality, with the Lord Mayor, aldermen, and citizens of London, now hereby, with one voice and consent of the tongue and heart, we publish and proclaim that the high and mighty Prince George Frederick Ernest Albert is now, by the death of our late sovereign of happy memory, become our only lawful and rightful liege Lord George V, by the grace of God, King of the United Kingdom of Britain and Ireland, and of the British dominions beyond the sea, defender of the faith, Emperor of India, to whom we do acknowledge all faith and constant obedience, with all hearty and humble affection, beseeching God, by whom kings and queens do reign, to bless the royal Prince George V with long and happy years to reign over us. God save the King. Less resoundingly, his wife also changed her name and her style. Until 1910, she had been known as May, using her first two names, Victoria Mary, for her official signature. She wrote to an aunt a few days after her accession, "I hope you approve of my new name, Mary. George dislikes double names, and I could not be Victoria, but it strikes me as curious to be rechristened at the age of 43. Queen Mary added, I regret the quieter, easier time we had, as everything will be more difficult now and more ceremonious." A pressing duty of the new sovereign was to receive the member of his government. As the Prime Minister, Mr. Asquith, had not yet returned from a visit to the Mediterranean, the first minister to be summoned to the Buckingham Palace was Chancellor of the Exchequer. The king, exceedingly nice, Mr. Lord wrote. He talked a good deal about his father, of whom he was evidently very fond of. his eyes suffused with tears. Grief at King Edward's death took many forms. Some of them were bizarre. One hostess of the late monarch threaded black ribbons through her daughter's underclothes. Another tied a large black bow of crape round a tree which he had planted in her garden 5 years before. A grocer in Jermyn Street saluted the passing of a dedicated trencherman by filling his window with black Braden hams. Sir Arthur Herbert, who, as British minister to Norway, had allowed dancing in his legation on what turned out to be the evening of the king's death. He was reprimanded by the Foreign Office and retired prematurely in the following year. A silent crowd of 250,000 subjects filed past the cattle peak in Westminster Hall during the 3 days of lying in state. Sir Schomberg Macdonald, Secretary of His Majesty's Office of Works, noticed that they were led by 3 women of the seamstress class, very poorly dressed and very reverent. Their sense of decorum, he added, was in sharp contrast to that of more exalted mourners. The Prime Minister was there with Miss Asquith, leaning against one of the lamp standards and watching the people pass. I thought his attitude and general demeanor rather offensive. I fear he had dined well, and he seemed to regard the occasion as a mere show. The behavior of the Home Secretary, Winston Churchill, was even more insensitive. At 10:40 one evening, after the hall had been closed for the night, he and his family descended on Westminster in a procession of 4 motor cars to view King Edward's coffin. One being refused admission, he argued and he abused an outraged custodian for withdrawing his party. That was characteristic of Churchill's early years in office. A few days earlier, during a formal audience with the new king, he had at once asserted that a great change was necessary in the Constitution. The sovereign, hurt by Churchill's lack of sympathy, contented himself with replying that he wasn't against all violent change. 8 kings and an emperor attended the funeral at Windsor. The bills for feeding them and other official mourners came to no less than £4,644. King Edward's pet terrier, called Caesar, was given a place in the procession immediately behind the coffin. The German emperor observed that he had done many things in his life, but he had never before been obliged to yield to the precedence of a dog. Lord Kinnoll's little daughter, an odd witness of the funeral, she refused to say her prayers that night. She said it won't be any use, because God will be too busy unpacking King Edward. Even in the midst of his grief, the new king was plagued by those trivialities of protocol, which at court so often jostle problems of more lasting moment. Thus, the household cavalry protested that they, not the Grenadier Guards, ought to have been entrusted with the protection of Edward VII's body before its removal from Buckingham Palace to Westminster. The Grenadiers, they conceded, had in 1901 guarded the remains of Queen Victoria at Osborne. But that was a private residence. It was not a royal palace. The question was referred to the Lord Chancellor, who sensibly decided that the sovereign could not be bound by precedent in selecting his servants for any particular duty. Another annoyance was the administrative incompetence of the Duke of Norfolk, who, as a hereditary Earl Marshal of England, bore responsibility for organizing the funeral in St. George's Chapel, Windsor, on the very day before the service, the ceremonial published by the Earl Marshal proved to be a full mistake. A senior courtier and 4 clerks shut themselves up for several hours rewriting it correctly. "I love the Duke," King George told Schomburg MacDonald. "He's charming, he's honorable, he's straightforward, a little gentleman, no better in the world. But as a man of business, he's absolutely impossible. I ask you, Palm, is it not hard on me?" The most disturbing influence during those first days of the new reign was Queen Alexandra's strong-willed and possessive sister, Marie Fedorovna. The Dowager Empress of Russia prompted King Edward's widow to claim precedence over the wife of the reigning sovereign. This is a custom followed in St. Petersburg, but it's unknown to the court of St. James. With characteristic restraint, neither King George nor Queen Mary was willing to challenge Queen Alexandra's pretensions at such a moment, and the Dowager Empress had her way. At the funeral, therefore, Queen Alexandra stood at the foot of her husband's coffin, accompanied only by her sister, while Queen Mary was relegated to an inferior place. Some of the special diplomatic missions proved equally troublesome. Monsignor Pichon, the French foreign minister, was scandalized to observe that Orleanist princes have been given precedence over him in the funeral procession and complained to the foreign secretary. Sir Edward Grey, sharing a carriage with the ex-president Theodore Roosevelt of the United States, he also grumbled at the discourtesy shown to the representatives of the Republic. Their coachman, he pointed out, was dressed in black, whereas the coachmen of the preceding royal carriages, they wore scarlet liveries. Roosevelt replied that he had not noticed and would have been equally content with a coachman clad in yellow and green. That crushing retort in imperfect French was lost on Pichon, who understood Roosevelt to be demanding a coachman dressed in just those colors. Nor did the special envoys always accept the ruling that they should take precedent of their respective embassies and legations in London. Shortly before the king was received each in turn at a stated time, one of them wrote to the master of the ceremonies, Lord Ormithwaite. He was much obliged, he said, if the king would receive him and his compatriots, first of all, as they had an important engagement that day in Manchester. Ormithwaite, tempted to reject the request out of hand, felt it his duty to submit to the king. That evening he received a reply. There was no outburst of rage, simply 5 penciled words and the king's initials. I will receive them last. The other problems of the new reign were not to be solved so imperiously. Okay. We're on to a separate section. Yeah. But I don't know if you can see this. So. But this right here, that's King Edward. And there he is with, that's with Alexandra, Prince Albert Victor, and Prince George when they were young. So if you can see that, that's what they were like. Very young. Albert Victor, and then Prince George sitting on Alexandra's lap, and then that's Bertie, King Edward VII. So I will go ahead and get started with the next section. King George V was within a week of his 45th birthday at the time of his succession. Although hardly less tall than his father, he lacked the majestic presence of the late king. Throughout his life, he remained slight of build and scorned the raised heels for which Edward VII added to his height. When Lady Minto entertained the then Prince of Wales at Governor House in Calcutta in 1906, she noted the weighing book, in which even the most eminent guests were required to register. This had been inaugurated by the future King Edward VII on the 3rd of January, 1876. Albert Edward, he wrote jocularly, 4 stone, 9¾ pound, in heavy military uniform. On the same date, exactly 30 years later, his son signed his name, George P., 10 stone, 7 pounds. During the next quarter of a century, his weight crept up little more than 7 pounds. Then illness robbed him of his usual exercise, and in the 1930s he wrote in his diary, "Saw tailors about my uniforms, which are too tight, alas." Not even the most skilled tailor could disguise one defect in his upper appearance of which he remained unhappily aware. He had knock knees. To cure his congenital malformation in his children, he obliged them to sleep in leg splints designed by Sir Francis Laking, the physician in ordinary. Once it was reported to him that Frederick Finch, the children's personal attendant, had given in to young Prince Albert's plea that they should be removed. The king sent for his kind-hearted but misguided retainer. Drawing his trousers tightly against his legs to display his own knock knees, he said sternly, "Look at me. If that boy grows up looking like this, it will be your fault." The treatment was resumed and proved successful. During a royal tour of South Yorkshire in the early years of the reign, Archbishop Lang overheard this conversation between two coal miners. "Now then, which is the king? It's little chap, the front with billycock hat. Nah, he ain't sech a fine man as Teddy. Well, anyway, he's gotten him a fine, upstanding wife." Saloon bar wits spoke of King George V and Queen Mary, the four-fifths. The French were similarly impressed by Queen Mary's stature and called her Soutine Georgesse, literally meaning George's support, but also a pun on Soutine George, meaning a brassiere. Although she appeared to be a tall, imposing woman who towered over her husband, that was an illusion. Her back was as stiff as a ramrod, and both hats and heels played a part in enhancing her stately deportment. She was, in fact, exactly the same size as the king. She was 5 foot 6 inches. Her shyness made her seem more formidable than she was. Lord Lincolnshire, created a marquess in 1912, wrote in his diary, "The king and queen were both gracious. They congratulated me warmly, and both gave me their hands, a rare occurrence with the present queen." Another courtier noted that shy nod which offends so much, and Miss Asquith claimed that he was more exhausted after dining next to her than at the end of a debate in the Commons. Endowed with neither inches nor a commanding presence, the king made the most of his modest attributes. His hair was always brushed, with care. His beard was neatly trimmed and anointed with lavender water, his manicured hands protected by gloves when shooting. Almost at death's door in 1928, he insisted on sending for a looking glass. He liked to have his family around him as he completed the ritual of dressing for dinner. The winding of the watch, the touch of the scent of the handkerchief, the last adjustments to a white tie and a garter star. It was as if the centuries had rolled away and the Sun King reigned once more at Versailles. Like his father, King George was obsessively concerned with what he wore. He grew up in an age that cared for such things. At the turn of the century, not even the poorest of his grandmother's subjects would venture out of the king's door without a hat. The rich changed their clothes several times a day. Sartorial decrees made no concessions to either climate or comfort. Arthur Lee, the Member of Parliament, who presented checkers to the nation as a country residence for the Prime Minister, resigned from the fashionable Hurlington Club in 1908 after his first visit. The flannel suit and Panama hat he thought appropriate for the hot summer afternoon had attracted unfriendly glances from his top-hated and tailor-coated fellow members. It was unusual for a man not to wear full evening dress in the stalls of the theater or when dining in his London club. What distinguished the king from his contemporaries was a lifelong obedience to Edwardian custom, an unobtrusive elegance of style that concealed nature's deficiencies. On formal occasions, he remained faithful to the frock coat and tall hat, their somber glow relieved by a protrusion of starched cuff, a white slip under the waistcoat, and perhaps a gardenia. For Ascot and other summer events, the entire ensemble might be gray. At a race meeting or at some such places like the Chelsea Flower Show, the king wore no less an impeccably cut suit of the finest brown or gray cloth. He had seen enough of the blue and the navy, crowned by a hard, high, curly-brimmed bowler hat of black, brown, or gray. His trousers were creased down the side, his overcoat generally long, his gloves ripped in black. He pulled his ties through a ring rather than knot them, and he kept them in place with a jeweled pin. He preferred boots to shoes, and invariably he carried a stick. On shooting days, his valet laid out tweeds of surprisingly bright check, 8-button spats that came almost up to his knees, and a Homburg hat. When sailing his yacht, the king wore a white flannel suit and a flat cap without a peak. Scotland received the compliment of kilt, Inverness cape, and feathered bonnet. It was as much a liturgy as a wardrobe. The king, he not only revered what had been fashionable in his early manhood, but he expected his family and household to share the same conservative taste. The refusal of his adventurous eldest son to accept such restrictions strained an already uneasy relationship between the king and his heir, a theme which belongs to a later chapter. Queen Mary, however, submitted to the king's almost oriental requirements with the meekness she brought to every aspect of their marriage. Her husband, she never forgot, was also her sovereign, and in response to his dictates, she continued for the rest of her life to wear only such styles and colors as he decreed. Little pleased him in a woman's fashion later than the bustle, a taste that may perhaps be traced to his perennial attachment to Mother Dear. Lady Airlie believed that Queen Mary, she secretly yearned to escape from those long dresses and toque hats which will be forever associated with her. In the event she permitted herself only one tiny flash of defiance, she refused to abandon those long earrings which, the king complained, distorted her ears, he said. Jeweled and gowned from some great ceremonial occasion or even party, she epitomized the traditional splendor of monarchy. By day, her appearance could evoke affectionate satire. The queen had a wonderful appearance and she had a wonderful success, a courtier wrote on a state visit to France in 1914. The Paris mob went mad about her, and it was rumored that her out of date hats and early Victorian gowns would become next year's fashions. It was with no sense of elation that King George V embarked on his reign. He told me he cannot sleep, Lord Esher wrote in his diary 10 days after the occasion. He wakes about 5 and finds himself making notes of things which lie before him in his day's work. The king also suffered from indigestion and a toothache, maladies on which he brooded with nervous melancholy. He was less superstitious than his father, who would never allow his mattress to be turned on a Friday, or he would willingly sit 13 to a dinner. King George was nevertheless haunted by a mid 19th century prophecy of obscure origin, told to him as Prince of Wales by some tactless well wisher. It was that Queen Victoria would have the longest and most memorable reign of all English sovereigns, that she would be succeeded in turn by two kings with short reigns, and then by a third called David, whose reign would be as glorious as hers. Well, that didn't come true now, did it? George was too considerate of a son to mention the prophecy to his father. But in May 1910, with the death of King Edward VII, after only 9 years on the throne, he had cause to reconcile himself to an equally short reign. And even if it were to be prolonged, the prospect of a burden which could be laid down only at a grave was scarcely more encouraging. The King of England is always king, Lord Chancellor Eldon had observed during the reign of an earlier George. The king is the king in the helplessness of infancy, the king in decrepitude of age. George V was also the despairing victim of two virulent slanders. One labeled him a drunkard, the other a bigamist. The myth of the king's addiction to alcohol had pursued him for several years. Lady Minto wrote in her diary at the time of his visit to India as the Prince of Wales. Lady Minto wrote, I heard from England the other day that the night of the Calcutta illuminations the prince dined with Lord Kirshner. This is quite true, as I sat next to him. The story went on that both the prince and Lord Kirshner were so drunk that they couldn't appear after dinner. I drove with the prince for an hour after dinner myself, and Lord Kirshner was in the next carriage. The prince knows about these reports and spoke to me about them. He said, I suppose they think the same of India thing. He said, I suppose they think the same thing in India because over one of the triumphal arcs was written, God help the prince. I think it's cruel, especially as he hardly touches any wine. or champagne or liqueur, only at night a light bit of Moselle. Soon after the king's accession, 5 years later, Count Mensdorf, the Austrian ambassador, mentioned the rumors in a dispatch to Vienna. His Majesty hears all sorts of remarks about his alleged alcoholism made by crowds in the street. At pious meetings in the East End of London, prayers are said for Queen Mary and for the royal children, begging the protection of heaven on their unhappy drunkard home. The Archbishop of Canterbury and the clergy, as well as those whose charitable works bring them in touch with the lower classes. And they are now trying to fight this risible legend of the drinking king. But it will take a long time to eradicate. Except for a red face and a loud voice, the king betrayed none of the symptoms associated with intemperance. He was, in fact, abstemious man, although he did like a glass of port after dinner. This would fill to the brim, and then he would lift his lips with the same steadiness of hand and eye that made him so commanding a shot. By continuing to excel at the sport he loved best, the king shamed some of his detractors into silence. The rest grew weary of the joke, and eventually the snigger ceased. The other rumor to cast a slur over the king's middle years had reached him in the week before he proposed to Princess May of Teck. On 25 April 1893, at the end of the Mediterranean holiday, he wrote to his father's private secretary from the British Embassy in Rome. The story of my being already married to an American is really very amusing. Cust has heard the same thing from England, only he heard that my wife lived in Plymouth. And why there, I wonder. On the 3rd of May, the very day of his betrothal, the Star newspaper in London published a more circumstantial account that the Duke of York had lately contracted a secret marriage in Malta with the daughter of a British naval officer. At first, he took it lightly. I say, May, he told his fiancée one day, we can't get married after all. I hear I've got a wife and 3 children. In the following year, however, the radical member of Parliament, Keir Hardie, scandalized the Commons during a debate on a motion to congratulate the Duke and Duchess of York on the birth of their first child. He said of the infant, Prince Edward, in due course, following the precedent which has already been set, he will be sent on a tour around the world, and probably rumors of a morganic alliance will follow, and at the end of it all will be the country will be called upon to pay the bill. Whispers of alleged bigamy continued to disturb Prince George throughout his years as the Duke of York and as Prince of Wales. He's particularly depressed at being powerless to deal with them. Mensdorf wrote in March 1910, he lacks the happy insolence, I don't know what that word is, of King Edward. Okay, he lacks the happy disposition of King Edward. With his accession to the throne in May, the rumors were revived. In spite of formal denials by the Dean of Norwich in July and by Bigg 3 months later. Towards the end of the year, however, there came an opportunity to destroy the lie once and for all. A Republican paper called The Liberator, published in Paris but sent free to every British member of Parliament, printed an article by E.F. Milas entitled Sanctified Bigamy. It asserted that in 1890 the future King George V had contracted a lawful marriage in Malta with a daughter of Admiral Sir Michael Calm Seymour, that children had been born of the union, and that 3 years later the bridegroom, having by his brother's death found himself in direct line of succession to the throne, foully abandoned his true wife and entered into a sham and shameful marriage with the daughter of the Duke of Teck. The article continued, "The Anglican Church, with its crew of emasculated, canting priests, presents little more resemblance to Christianity than if it were some idol fetish of a tribe of South Sea cannibals. Our very Christian king and defender of the faith has a plurality of wives, just like the Muhammad Sultan, and they are sanctified by the Angelical Church." The next issue of the Liberator had returned to the theme. The Daily News of London tells us that the king plans to visit India with his wife. Would the newspapers kindly tell us which wife? Already, however, the law officers of the Crown had decided that Milas should be prosecuted for criminal libel. The Attorney General was Sir Rufus Isaacs, the late Lord Reading, the future Lord Chief Justice and Viceroy of India. The Solicitor General was Sir John Simon, the future Foreign Secretary and Lord Chancellor. In a joint opinion, which was dated 23 November 1910, those two astute and formidable lawyers doubted the wisdom of giving worldwide publicity to an article in an obscure paper with a small circulation. They nevertheless recognized that all the principal witnesses to the falsehood of the story were still alive. The eldest, Admiral Calm Seymour, being in his 75th year, that tipped the scales in favor of prosecution. Winston Churchill, the Home Secretary, had preferred such a course from the beginning. He wrote to the king on the 18th of December 1910, "The libel is only an obscure undercurrent circulating among the credulous and base. Still it is sufficiently widespread to be a source of vexation to your majesty." Milas was arrested on 26 December. The government, determined to deny the prisoner every opportunity of appealing for public sympathy before his trial, he appeared to strain the spirit of law. Milas was allowed bail, but as Churchill had told the king, the amount, £10,000, and two sureties of £5,000 each, was prohibitive. Nor was there a preliminary hearing of the charge before the magistrate. Thus, it is probable, the Home Secretary reported to his sovereign, "The attention of the public will not be directed to the matter at all until the whole case will be put before them with the Attorney General's carefully considered statement, the full evidence of the falsity of the libel, and, it is to be expected, the sentence of the court." A bold move on the part of Milas to have a subpoena served on the king as a witness was also frustrating. The application was heard privately in the chambers of the Lord Chief Justice, Lord Alverstone, and rejected. That claim by Milas was in fact contrary to the constitutional law. As a source of justice, the sovereign himself cannot give evidence. Although King Edward VII did so as Prince of Wales on two occasions. One during the Morden divorce case, and again in the actions for slander brought by Sir William Gordon Cumming against his fellow guest at Tranby Croft. In any case, Churchill assured Bigg, in the absence of the slightest shadow or vestige of evidence to justify the libel, the claim of the defendant that the king should appear in is a mere piece of imprudent buffoonery, and it should be brushed away with the contempt it deserves. The case came before the Lord Chief Justice and a jury on the 1st of February, 1911. Admiral Sir Michael Seymour gave evidence that he had assumed command of the Mediterranean fleet in 1893, that his wife and 2 daughters who joined him in Malta in the same year had never before been on the island, that his younger daughter, Laura Grace, had died unmarried in 1895 without ever having spoken to the king, and that his elder daughter, May, had not met the king between 1879, when she was 8 years old, and 1898. May, who in 1899 had married the future Vice Admiral Sir Trevelyan Napier, gave supporting testimony, as did her 3 brothers. It was also proved that the king had not been in Malta between 1888 to 1901, and that there was no record of his alleged marriage in the registers of the island, which the jury were invited to inspect. Milas, who chose to be unrepresented by counsel, did not attempt to refute the evidence, but clung to his claim that the king should be summoned as a witness. When that renewal plea was again rejected, he offered no further defense. The jury returned a verdict of guilty, and the Lord Chief Justice sentenced Milas to 12 months' imprisonment. That's the maximum in his various publications that were not to be treated as separate libels. After a sentence had been passed, the Attorney General read a statement signed by the king. It declared that he had never been married except to the Queen, nor gone through any ceremony of marriage with her, and that he would have been given such evidence in person had not the law and officers advised him that it was unconstitutional for the sovereign to appear in the witness box. That in fact, that was the real purpose of the prosecution, less to punish Milas than to vindicate the king's honor. With the existing framework of the law, it had been easy to achieve. Simon, the Solicitor General, wrote in his diary, "We were very lucky to bring Milas' case to a satisfactory end. If Milas, instead of justifying, had pleaded guilty and explained that he was only repeating what thousands of reputable people had said for years without being prosecuted for it, we could never have established the falsity of the lie so effectively." A few years after hearing the verdict, the king wrote in his own hand to Churchill. He thanked him for his help in proving to the world at large that the base of this cruel and abominable lie. He marked his indebtedness to the Isaacs and Simon by appointing each of the Royal Victorian Order, a distinction founded by his grandmother to reward personal service to the royal family. Over the years, the king continued to demonstrate his gratitude to the 2 law officers. An opportunity occurred in 1913 when, on retirement of Lord Elverstone, the Prime Minister nominated Sir Rufus Isaacs to succeed him as Lord Chief Justice of England. The Attorney General had a prescriptive right to the office, and Isaacs was acknowledged to be at the summit of his profession. A few months earlier, however, a division in the House of Commons along party lines had been endorsed by only 346 votes to 268. The probity of his stock exchange dealings in Marconi shares. Ilex had behaved imprudently by investing in the Marconi Company of America as a result of confidential information given to him by his brother, who was the managing director of English Marconi, itself a company engaged in negotiating an important contract with the British government that would need to be ratified by Parliament. And in purporting to explain his speculation to the Commons, the Attorney General had displayed a deplorable lack of candor. It was therefore understandable that his swift elevation to be the Lord Chief Justice should arouse both spiteful comment and genuine dismay. As a constitutional monarch, the king was required to do no more than give his formal approval to the appointment. He nevertheless sent Isaacs a message of warm congratulations. The new Lord Chief Justice wrote to Lord Stamfordham, as Bigg had become in 1911, "Please tell the king that he's given me the loftiest encouragement to serve him and the state and the state, and that I shall ever treasure and remember his words." The king similarly, he showed more cordiality to Sir John Simon than did the Solicitor General's political colleagues, who thought him able but devious and insincere. On being made a Privy Councillor in 1913, Simon wrote to thank his sovereign for the honor. The king noted, "A charming letter from a very nice man." Nearly 20 years of sly prosecution had left too deep a wound in the king for him to show magnanimity to his tormentor Milas. 2 weeks after the trial, Stamfordham wrote to Edward Marsh. This was Churchill's private secretary, expressing the hope that the prisoner would not be released before his sentence had expired. Any leniency, he added, it will produce no gratitude in him or his friends, and it might lead the public to think that the trial was a put-up affair. Stamfordham later telephoned Marsh to confirm that this represents the king's wish. That hint to the Home Secretary, although vindictive, it was justified. On his release from prison, Milas returned to the attack in a pamphlet entitled The Morganic Marriage of George V, published in New York. In it, he not only rehearsed the arguments which had been refuted at his trial, he also produced what he claimed to be new evidence in support of his allegations of bigamy. May Calm Seymour, he wrote, had been mistaken in swearing that she had never met the king between 1879 and 1898. Having combed the files of the Hampshire Telegraph and Sussex Chronicle, he discovered that the admiral's daughter had opened the dancing with the Duke of York at a ball in Portsmouth Town Hall in 21 August 1891. That slip of memory on the part of Miss Calm Seymour about an event that had taken place 20 years before, it was utterly irrelevant to the accusation of bigamy. Not even Milas was prepared to assert that the supposed marriage had been either consecrated or consummated in Portsmouth Town Hall. The pamphlet made a more plausible point when it turned to the whereabouts of the future king during the year he was alleged to have secretly married May Calm Seymour. The Crown witness testified that the King George had been not officially in Malta in that year of 1890. Investigations made subsequent to my trial showed that in the year of 1890, Prince George was appointed commander of the gunboat Thrush, which arrived in Gibraltar on June 9, 1890, on its way to the North American station, and left on the 25th of the same month after an interval of 16 days. Malta is only a 5-day trip from Gibraltar. What was Prince George doing between June 9th and June 25th of 1890? There is no record of his stay in Gibraltar during those days or of him having attended any social functions in the city. And why should George go 4,000 miles out of his course of his way to the North American station? Readers of this work will know exactly why Prince George went 4,000 miles out of his course of way to the North American station. HMS Thrush was required to tow a torpedo boat to Gibraltar before crossing the Atlantic. As for those supposedly missing 16 days, the prince's own letters and diaries provide a full and exact chronicle of how he spent them while awaiting the completion of repairs to his ship's engines. Like any other young naval officer, he played polo and tennis, billiards and whist. He went on picnics and watched the apes. He dined in the messes of the hospitable regiments such as the Black Watch. That left no time for clandestine return voyage to Malta and a secret marriage. The reputation of King George and of Miss May Calm Seymour emerged unsullied from Milas's deceitful postscript. The trial of 1911 evoked a widespread public sympathy for the king. It was reflected in the changing attitudes to the monarchy of the novelist Henry James, who, although remaining a United States citizen until 1915, he took a fervent interest in British institutions. On the death of Queen Victoria in 1901, James had written, "The Prince of Wales is an arch vulgarian. The wretched little Yorks are less than nothing, and I am very pessimistic." 10 years later, he discovered his nephew Edward Holton James had been associated with Milas in producing The Liberator, and he cut him out of his will. Okay, I'm going to stop there because there are more pages to read and we're coming up on an hour. So this will probably be in like a two episode. So thank you for listening.